Suicide Zen Forgiveness, the pod that shares the stories of those affected by suicide. Lost a loved one? Attempted it yourself? Did you know that when you share a burden, the load is lightened? Come listen in with your host, Elaine Lindsay.
Suicide Zen Forgiveness, the podcast, is for education only. Some of the subject matter could be triggering for those that are newly grieving or in a poor state of mental health. Please call your local suicide hotline or mental health office if you need immediate help. Hello there. It's good to be back. I'm with you today on Suicide Zen Forgiveness. And today we're talking to a very interesting guest. I'm really excited to bring him to you. His name is Brad Wetzler, and he speaks and writes passionately, about mental health, men's issues, and spirituality. He's got a new memoir coming out, or has just, recently come out, called Into the Soul of the World, My Journey to Healing. It's an adventure journalist story of a decade-long round-the-world quest to overcome his drug addiction and to understand and heal from past traumas. He suffered from PTSD and severe depression from past traumas, battled an addiction to overprescribed psychiatric medication, and at his rock bottom in his career, he had nowhere else to go, so he set out on this journey. Today, we're going to talk about all of that and other things from Brad. So thank you so much. Here he comes.
Hi, Elaine. Hi. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much for joining me as a guest. It's wonderful to be able to look at other things in mental health as well as suicide and suicide survivors, because I believe all of those pieces are tied together. And I'm on a mission to end the silence, the stigma, and the shame surrounding both suicide and mental health. The more we know, the better off we're all going to be.
I hear you, and I agree. Couldn't agree more. So I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, that's great. So that sounds like quite a trek. 10 years of searching. We'll get to that. I want you to start probably where you were at your lowest and how you got to go on that journey.
Yeah. So I'd been a very successful magazine writer, a journalist, and my focus was on adventure writing and also politics. I wrote for all the top magazines in the nation. But as I had become successful, I was struggling with depression and what I later learned was trauma and PTSD. But I had been misdiagnosed at a young age with bipolar disorder. And so that's kind of the crux of this story, is that I got hooked up with a doctor that I kept coming in seeking answers with the doctor, and he kept trying one thing after the next and never really took me off anything until I was taking, I think, 12 or 13 medications, 23 pills a day. And they were everything from standard antidepressants, to mood stabilizers, to antipsychotics, to dexedrine, a very strong stimulant. And then, of course, other meds to help, with sleep and appetite, because the antipsychotics added, I gained a lot of weight on that. So long story short, I was taking all these medications and I basically went to bed, although it was more of a walking zombie because of the stimulants I was on, but I was basically asleep, but on my feet. And I was basically struggled to, I'd go to a cafe with a stack of magazines that I had been on the covers of in the previous years, and I would struggle to even read them. My relationship was ending, my marriage. And though I've never seriously considered suicide, I did keep, as I've written in the book, a shotgun in the closet to in case things got that bad, and I feared they would. So, around that time, I was at the rock bottom. A friend of mine did succeed. That's not the right word. I'm sorry, but did end up killing himself, dying by suicide. And I got a phone call at 5 a.m, and I knew that what had happened, and just by the tone of voice, and it was his mother. He was about 30 years old, and I remember sitting with his body in the hallway. And just realizing I needed to, he was on a similar dosage of medications, also for bipolar disorder, which he'd also suffered serious traumas. And I now doubt his bipolar diagnosis. But long story short, I was sitting with his body and realized that I had to make some major change in my life. So that's when the story began. And that period of time was anywhere from 5 to 7 years. It's hard to really know when the medications hit this kind of maximum point. But 5 to 7 years, I stopped writing. I ended up on disability. It was just a terrible time in my life.
Wow. That's an awful lot to go through, and to have it stare you in the face like that by losing a friend. Mm. I mean, it's awful that was your wake-up call, but in another way, it's good because you're here.
Yeah, I hear you, and I see it. I do see it that way. And I remember going home that afternoon and just feeling so exhausted and lying down. And it was just like, as I was lying down, it was almost like there was eyes inside me that were beginning to wake up, and I could see something, and I also though could see how hard it was going to be. I know there are a lot of personal transformation coaches out there, and I knew in my body, this was not going to be an easy journey. And it was going to be a complicated one for me. And I hope your viewers don't have it doesn't take 10 years, but it did for me. And it took a quite circuitous route. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, 10 years, as much as that is long, some of us have taken up to 39 years to get there. It is sometimes a very halting journey, and sometimes you get on that right path. And although it's 10 years, it seems probably in hindsight that it was a straight trip in a way.
Yeah. Well, and I think it sort of was a series of revelations, I think, like any kind of story of recovery. And one of the earlier revelations that I read an article in the New York Times about the cause of so much depression is toxic shame. And, I came of age in my early 20s when I first saw a psychiatrist at a time when these medications, the psychiatrists believed they were just the be all and end all and the answer. And there was also a belief in the sort of the biological brain chemistry, idea that this is what depression was. There was a lot of people like me that got diagnosed with bipolar at that time, when it was shame and it was situational kind of depression. And we just all got thrown into I began taking lithium. This is another heavy story, but a friend of my family's introduced me to my first psychiatrist, and he had become excited about this bipolar diagnosis and was convinced I had it. And I was only suffering from depression at the time. And I spent 50 minutes in session with this doctor. One session, I talked about, he hardly asked about my family situation or my background. And I told a few stories, and I've always been a spiritual person and always had kind of these somewhat mystical experiences. And that was the mistake I made in mentioning that. And he became convinced I was bipolar and having, manic episodes. And long story short, that was the road into the medications. When the lithium didn't help me, then they kept adding more and more and more. And I sort of, in retrospect, it's hard to believe, you know, and he was a diligent doctor. I hardly, you know, I was there with my hand out for, you know, for his empathy as a young man seeking a father figure and someone who'd listened to my problems and also said he had solutions that seemed science-based. And, you know, and that was another problem of just trusting too much. And so I own some of that, but it did become an addiction. I know that my nervous system now was quite frayed and agitated from the traumas, and I was soothing myself with these legal pills. You know?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I have to go back there and say that wasn't your mistake.
Yeah.
Okay. The training at the time for psychiatrists and psychologists, they were very deep in the cornucopia of pharmaceuticals. And we now know they still don't know how or why some of these things work.
Yes.
Which is why for such a long time things were wildly overprescribed.
When I have doctor friends today, neurologists, and even they seem baffled when I talk about trauma. They weren't educated in it, and they just sort of like they have no capacity to even hear it. It's quite bizarre. I know.
No, and it's funny because I was told probably about 10 years ago something about, well, you know, who's handling your PTSD? And I said, what? I've never been in the military. What are you talking about? You know, we don't necessarily know all the things that should be open discussion. We should know about trauma and what comes from trauma. We should know that PTSD is possible in all humans.
Yes.
You know, but because we hide so many things, and we are so, I believe, molded by shame.
Yeah.
It's very hard for people to get their stories out there. And that's one why I commend you on the book and coming on here and talking.
Mm-hmm.
But in a journey of 10 years, going around the world, to me, that's in a way, it's fantastical that you were had the presence of mind, perhaps, to make that journey. So, what was, say, the very first light you could see that you were on the right path?
Well, you know, interestingly, the first thing I did a few months after the death of my friend was one day I read this article about something called the Jesus Trail in Israel. And so I had been a fanatical young Christian as a boy. My family wasn't necessarily, but I found solitude in a group that. So long story short, and when I left high school, I kind of left that path behind. And so the first thing I did is I wanted to hike this Jesus Trail, and I wanted to just try to understand what my obsession had been about as a kid. And I also just knew that at a root level that, you know, spirituality, and I doubted it would be my old Christian path, but I knew that I needed some understanding or some connection to something larger than myself to heal.
Yeah. And
so I spent 10 weeks traveling across Israel and Palestine, kind of asking myself, could I be on that path again? And the answer when I finally left was no, but it did light up something, and I started to get a deeper understanding of the word faith, and I was reading a lot, and I stumbled on this idea, and I hope if this is too intellectualized for this conversation, but this idea that before the Enlightenment, you could have faith without it needing to be true or scientifically true. You could believe in something without it necessarily needing to believe in all the facts of it. And this is a subtle point, but I started to understand that I could have faith in myself, in something greater than myself, and faith that I was here for some purpose other than being medicated and even traveling as a travel writer. And I began to just trust myself and trust these feelings that were starting to emerge in my body, that I was coming alive. And even, and as I began to get off the medications and I did start to work, I moved and found a new psychiatrist who's first said, let's get you off as much of this as we can and see who you are. And he said, I'm not even going to talk about diagnoses for a year. And eventually I got off, most of the things. And I today, just full disclosure, I take a light antidepressant and I take an ADD med, and that helps me because some of these symptoms of the trauma and the PTSD lead to brain fog and also to this depression that I'm just so used to being in. So the travel, I knew that travel and spiritual seeking was going to be part of the journey, but I also then knew that finding good help was going to be part of it. So that's kind of was an outward, inward thing at the same time.
I love that. And I think it's wonderful that you had that early grounding in Christianity that gave you a thirst for more knowledge, because there are certain I would say bonuses in having that kind of faith, be it Christianity or be you a Muslim or the Jewish faith, whatever you are, having that faith in a higher power can help you get through a lot of difficult times. And often it is blind faith. You don't have empirical data that says, well, X is this and Y is this, therefore. It just is an absolutely blind faith that can get one through. And it's unfortunate some of us lose that and have to find our way back to our own type of spirituality, which sounds to me that's where you ended up.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It became, I started working with a therapist in Boulder, Colorado, where I was living at the time, who was had been a lifelong Buddhist, and the psychiatrist ended up diagnosing me, believe it or not, the psychiatrist did, with PTSD, and then it was confirmed by another doctor and another therapist, and I began working with this therapist who. And I was dabbling in Eastern religion and thinking at that time, and I think one of the things that faith does, and being on a faith path, whatever it is I had a lot to relearn. I had found myself, I had, one of the things about complex PTSD, which is I had both PTSD from a canoeing accident and then complex PTSD from growing up in an alcoholic, narcissistic family system and being the scapegoat. And so I had a really kind of an incomplete sense of self. In some ways, I felt like I was a sage, like I was a yogi in a cave. And in other ways, I felt like I was about 13 years old. And I had to kind of go on this journey of growing up and one of the things that the spiritual paths do, of course, all spiritual paths have their basic tenets. And I fell in love with yoga eventually. And, there's these yamas and the niyamas. Well, that was step one, as I could start to, they're kind of the 10 commandments of yoga in a way. And I needed that, I'd lacked kind of that kind of fatherly way of learning what good behavior was. I had to kind of, use these as an ethical system. And so, and I began to lean on that. I also began to get back in my body through the yoga and then explore the deeper kind of philosophies of the Eastern wisdom. And that became really meaningful to me, and understanding that the idea that we have a soul and that our soul is connected to perhaps the soul of the world, which is obviously the name of my book. And it truly, and I don't have any firm answers to tell anybody, I can't talk about it in a way that I know you can find this too. This is what worked for me. And and I also believed that, I think it was Carl Jung that said all life problems in middle age and beyond are basically spiritual problems. And it's a sense of finding wholeness, and our medical system is so focused on pulling apart, and my own mind pulled myself apart, a very self-abusive inner critic. And so I started to see I had to put things back together. I had to find more wholeness and maybe more holiness at the same time, and stop tearing myself apart, and stop, believing in systems, wholeheartedly, like psychiatry, which is so diagnostic. And so this is what your problem is. And of course it serves a function and everything, but it's just not, it's a tool, not a worldview. And I had fallen for it as a worldview.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe the more, the bigger wealth of tools we have that are in different areas. It's like, okay, if the only thing you ever eat is chicken noodle soup,
yeah,
you're doing yourself a disservice, because there's so much more out there. And as much as you're getting protein, you're getting carbs, you're getting some fat, so technically you could live on that, not well, and you wouldn't be super energetic. But it's like that, in that you've pigeoned yourself into this little wedge, and living is existing. It's not really living.
That's a great point. And interestingly, I think trauma and PTSD can make us, interesting you use that example of chicken noodle soup, because it can make us rigid and make us quite narrow focused. And you really nailed how it can feel. We're willing to just look at what's directly in front of us. Psychiatry, okay, this is my path. And we have a harder time seeing the vastness,
Well, yeah, it's a harder time. And I think too, sometimes it's the fear of what is outside of that narrow focus is so overwhelming that we're the horses with the blinders on, because the only way we can go forward is if we're directed.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So after Jerusalem and Palestine, where did you head next?
Okay, so I ended up moving from Santa Fe, where I'd been living and working. I'd been a journalist and had lived out of, and was married and had a house there. I ended up, going through a divorce, and I moved to Boulder, Colorado, which was a wonderful place for kind of spiritual exploration. And I knew I traveled to India in 1999, and I was just at the verge of still being quite functional, but I was starting to slow down from the medications. I was getting puffy. My stamina was slowing down. I was not well, but even though I was functioning still at a fairly high level and writing articles, and after I finished, it was kind of a business culture article about the tech industry in India. And so as soon as I was done, though, I hired a car, and I started visiting holy sites in southern India. And then I met a man that said that I really should go to Varanasi, where one of the holiest places in India. It's where people often go to at the end of their lives, and they have these large, they're called the burning ghats, and these cremation fields. And so I decided to go there, and I just had the deepest, most soulful experience in these kind of charnel grounds. And then I visited a temple to the god Shiva, and I was still quite naive to all the complexity of these religions, but I just had this experience. And so when I was in Boulder, I knew I would long to go back to India. I felt like India was in my bones, and so eventually, as I got this diagnosis of trauma and PTSD and began to heal and began working with a trauma specialist and a new psychiatrist that really understood trauma, I signed up for a trip to northern India. Now, let me back up. I kind of became obsessed with these two spiritual teachers that kind of emerged from this in the 60s and 70s, but Ram Dass was one of them.
Yes.
And his friend Krishna Das, who was a singer. And I began watching movies about these two men who had found, especially Krishna Das, had struggled with his own addictions and depressions. And I watched this movie about him probably 100 times. And I just knew I had to go to this part of India where he and Ram Dass had been. And so I signed up for this trip and I went, and I just had one day. So this is where we start to get towards the end of the book. But one of my friends said that there was a 100-year-old yogi that lived in a cave at the top of this mountain. And I said, oh, we've got to go see him. And so we hiked up, an hour and a half to get to the top of this mountain. And we took our shoes off and entered this cave, and everyone, there's what, 5 of us or so. And I came in last, and as I crawled through this cave, and we've all bowed at his feet one by one. And as I bowed at his feet, and it was quite such an extraordinary experience. I mean, who would have thought that I would end up in my, early 50s healing from trauma and at the feet of this yogi, and he's just ancient looking. And as I have my head on the ground, and as I start to sit up, he kind of slaps my head really hard. And I learned enough by then about this idea in Eastern religions of Shaktipat, which is a physical spiritual transmission. And some of you all out there might be doubtful of this, but it's a different world over there. Yeah. And there's extraordinary things that we are not aware of over here. And so he hit me on the head, and I sat up, and we looked in each other's eyes, and I started weeping. And I still hardly can contain myself as I describe it. And I just felt like I was weeping, decades and maybe even lifetimes of grief. And just there's this thing called the glance of mercy, where a sage like that can look upon you, and it can create this intense experience. Well, that night I went to bed, and the next morning I woke up, and I always wake up before dawn, and I was sitting out reading out on this open area overlooking this deep valley. This is in the Himalayan foothills, and I was watching these birds, and these 2 birds were like playing and flying out over the valley, and then coming back, and then going back out, and then coming back, and I kind of started to fall into a trance, and I got up to get more tea, and my legs hardly could support me. And so I walked down this path to where I was staying with my then girlfriend, and a snake crawled across the path. And snakes, first of all, are very symbolic of transformation. Mm-hmm. And this snake, though, the earth behind it was like vibrating. And I looked up in the sky, and the mountains were kind of vibrating together. And so guess what my first reaction was? I went into to my room, and I was convinced I was getting sick, right? I needed pills of some kind.
Oh.
Antibiotics. I've got to figure out what's going on. Maybe I should take another antidepressant, or whatever. Because it was something that I thought was wrong, but it was actually as good a thing as you could have happen. And so, long story short, this trance lasted 12 hours. I sat on the roof of this small building and just cried tears of joy and grief, and almost like I couldn't connect with any of the suffering I'd been through. And so it was quite an extraordinary experience and I got back, and this was almost the coolest part of it is I was working with a psychiatrist who was quite traditional and sort of very old school, but I had seen him at a couple of these chanting events called kirtans. And so I knew on some level I could tell him about this experience. And unlike that early psychiatrist that pathologized it, he put his pen down after I told him, and he said, I have no doubt this was real. And he said, this doesn't happen to just anybody. You deserve this, and maybe you earned it. And it was real. And it was sort of the most extraordinary moment of my life in a way. Just to have that validation from a Westerner, and it was just amazing. And I still think about that as, trauma is when something too confusing or terrible happens for our minds and bodies to process it. But I now what happens when something is too good? And it's almost like I had a hard time processing it.
Yeah.
But that moment has become an anchor for me for remembering the soul, that, this part of me that is underneath all the traumas and underneath the suffering, and that it is real, and we can hold fast to that in our times of darkness. So
I love everything you've said. I completely believe everything you said, because I've followed a little bit of a path in some Indian medicine. And it's interesting to me that our lizard brain, if you will, in that moment of pure joy, immediately it goes to, let's get back to the comfort zone. We need some pills. Okay, something's wrong here. Because even though it was joy, ecstasy, that's not a place that we feel safe, which is kind of sad.
It is. And it's actually something that's currently coming up in my own therapy work, is understanding just how much I've tamped myself down over the years because of the way I learned to be as a young person. And it was not okay to be exuberant and all these things. And so I'm now trying to live in more joy, and it's not an easy thing. And it's,
No, it really isn't. But it is so wonderful in the moments that you can.
Yes. And to also be realistic and not fall for the idea that we can sustain joy. I think this is one of the beauties of the Eastern path is, I think we think in the West that we can buy our way to happiness. We can do this or that and find some kind of sustained happiness. And there's a real acceptance that all emotions come and go. And that, essentially there's suffering in the world. And when you acknowledge that and sit with that and be okay with that, that was a big benchmark in my recovery too. I think, some of us grow up in these perfectionistic families that that kind of teach us on an unconscious level that we should be happy, buck up and you should be happy. And I think when you accept that it's okay to feel frustrated or sad, and to allow those feelings to move through you, that you can find more peace. And I think that's one of the amazing teachings of the Buddha and other, paths in the East. So.
Oh, absolutely. And that is a big problem, especially in the West, where you are so buttoned up and you're brought up to be buttoned up and not show the emotions that are considered, they're not the great ones. So let's just not show that. But they're all meant to flow and go.
And to show the inside to the outside and vice versa.
Yeah.
The balance, so you can express yourself as who you are, rather than, this mask we have to wear so often to function in our Western world. So.
Absolutely. And wearing a mask and trying to maintain that other is exhausting.
Yeah. And that people pleasing is a symptom of complex trauma, right? So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's next for you?
So I think I moved to Austin a couple of years ago. And, I think one of the things that I've learned is, I'm careful about, there's a lot of trauma gurus out there right now, and I think the thing that I have to remember is our nervous systems, don't often heal totally, and even in trauma work. And what really changes is our relationship with ourselves and our traumas, and how we manage ourselves when we get activated. And so I'm really realistic about but my life is good. And I'm getting ready to start writing a new book. I think I want to write a book about masculinity. And I think that this is sort of the next thing. So much of this work I've realized is unusual for men to do this kind of work. And it came, I wouldn't say naturally to me, but I've always been inclined to try these modalities and ways of thinking that aren't typically masculine. And I kind of want to understand, what's a good man? That's kind of and I want to travel around the world asking people this question. So I think that's what's next for me. So.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. Yeah, I think that's
and who knows? I mean, I'm actually, it's kind of bizarre. I was thinking, this morning, when the shame starts to heal, you begin to experience yourself differently, and you almost have a grieving process of, you have to let go of the old person you were. And I'm kind of in this kind of state of flux now where I am finding more joy. And at the same time, it's confusing. It's confusing to feel better.
I totally get that. Yeah. And that's a really good point for the audience, because in changing yourself, however you change, whatever parts of you change, whether it be emotional, mental, or physical, there is grief involved because you are putting that other person away. We don't acknowledge the grief we have for leaving childhood,
right,
for leaving our teenagers, whether they were good, bad, or indifferent. We've left that person behind. And we don't acknowledge the grief that goes along with that.
Yes. And I have ended up estranged from my family. We never did find a path back to each other. Their story of the family is couldn't be more different than mine. And also, that's a good thing for your listeners to realize is, of course, it's probably more ideal to have connection with your family. At the same time, denial is a heavy duty thing, and families of alcoholism and narcissism can often, it works like a cult. And so I was fortunate, at one point my therapist in Boulder, looked at me and said, you're no longer a child of your family. You're a child of God and a child of the universe. And, you got out of this family with your soul, and that may not be true of the other siblings. I have an older brother and younger sister, and so I do think about that. I hope they have their souls. I don't know if she's true, but I know I got out with mine, and that's the important thing. And right now it works best for me to not be in contact. So,
and I do understand that, because there are times where our safety has to be paramount. We have to put ourselves first. What's wonderful and what I want the audience to know is the people you surround yourself with, they may not biologically be your family.
Yes.
But they can be your chosen family.
Yeah. And that, I will say and admit that was probably the hardest part of the journey, was letting go of the illusions and getting to the other side of that, where I can see my friends and the people around me now as family. And I can even hold my family of origin up as I learned some good things and some not so good things. And I don't need to have a lot of negative energy toward them. And, I think forgiveness is a complicated thing. I feel like I've arrived there in some large degree. I also am careful about, I don't think people should be forced into forgiveness too soon. And so, yeah.
No, and also there is a huge difference between forgiving and forgetting.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer in, if you don't want to repeat mistakes, then don't forget what the mistake was. Absolutely. In the first place.
Yeah.
So are you heading out soon to start this new trek to answer that question?
I think by the end of the summer, early fall. I've got some work to do to plan out the book and to discuss it with my agent, and to get it really in the works. But I'm planning on, I'm doing the preliminary research now, and I also have another book idea. So who knows? I think the masculinity one is the one I'll do first. But I'm also in the early process of promoting this book, and that takes up a lot of time. And I would like to mention that to your listeners to perhaps buy into The Soul of the World, my journey to healing. And it is a very it's an adventure story, and it has its highs and lows, but it's quite a journey around to these most exotic, profound spiritual places of the world, and seeking externally, but also really deeply seeking internally for a sense of peace. And I've largely gotten there, and I'm pleased to say. So yeah, with caveats that we always have something coming down the pike that we have to deal with. So
absolutely. My spiritual advisor says to me, we are onions. There is always another layer.
Right. Yeah.
And as the audience knows, all the information to do with Brad and the book and his social links and everything else will be on the page with the episode, so that you can click through and get his book. And we'll keep our ears open for his next book as well. Brad, I have to thank you so much for being my guest today. This has been a really not just interesting and eye-opening, but you've got me very curious, and I can't wait to read the book.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. And it's just been a joy to be in conversation with you. What a great podcast you have. So,
well, thank you. I do appreciate that. As I always say, thank you so much for taking your time and listening with us. I'm Elaine Lindsay. This is Suicide Zen Forgiveness. Make the most of your today, every day. And I will see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe on your favorite service. Suicide Zen Forgiveness was brought to you by Truel Social Media, the digital integration specialists. Let them get you on page 1 in the search results.
And also by Canada's keynote humorist, Judy Croon, the motivational speaker, comedian, author, and stand-up coach at Second City. On the stage, Judy draws from her wealth of performance experience, wit, and insight to entertain, inform, and inspire in her dynamic keynotes and half-day workshops.